Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Maria Sophia and I am a manager of government affairs here at Cato. Today we're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion known as DEI policy. This issue has been a hot topic that has been seen to have complex impacts. Policymakers are working to tackle this new area of policy, and today we have Senator Eric Schmitt from the state of Missouri and Cato Research Fellow Erec Smith. Senator Eric Schmitt was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2022 and previously served as Missouri's Attorney General, State Treasurer, and a state senator. Currently in the U.S. Senate, he serves on the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, the Armed Services Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee. Thank you, Senators.
Great to be here.
Erec Smith is a research fellow here at the Cato Institute and the president and co-founder of Free Black Thought, a website dedicated to highlighting viewpoint diversity within the African American population. Although he has many scholarly interests, Smith's primary work focuses on the rhetorics surrounding racial issues and theory. Smith's recent writings include several op-eds, as well as his books, A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition, The Semblance of Empowerment, published in 2020, and The Lure of Disempowerment, Reclaiming Agency in the Age of CRT, published in 2022. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here today and agreeing to do this. Before we get started and we dive into the weeds of this, it is worth noting that almost everyone agrees on the importance of a diversity of backgrounds, opinions, perspectives throughout all aspects of society, not just throughout government. And we are better off today as a society because of it. But today we're here to talk about the right approach to achieving these goals. So to start right off, you both have done work in this space trying to go about it with at times a different point of view. Senator Schmitt, you've introduced legislation and have been very active in this space. How did you become aware and then as a result work on this policy area?
So I think for me, back in 2018, I had seen, so I just was elected to statewide office in Missouri. I was a state senator from the St. Louis area, was elected to statewide office as state treasurer before I became attorney general. And I think seeing some of the things that were happening on college campuses, whether it was, the sort of suppression of particular viewpoints, I wanted to understand more about what was happening on college campuses. And so I ended up teaching a class 2 semesters at my alma mater, St. Louis University. And it was 21st century American civics. I had kind of free reign with the curriculum. And the idea for me was to better understand what was going on, but also to find out what can we do to move forward on things that actually sort of unite us? And we spent a lot of time about sort of how we got to a place with the American idea, with the revolution, sort of this mission statement we have with the Declaration of Independence that all people are created equal and that we're born with certain rights. That was revolutionary. And so anyway, the point is, we got to a place, and some people took the class because they wanted to agree with me or disagree with me, or they were there to learn. It didn't matter. It was a really good discussion, and I was hopeful coming from that. And I think what you see is a real effort on the left to deconstruct all of those things that actually bring us together, right? The idea that we do have a lot more in common than what sets us apart, and this sort of cultural Marxism movement that is embodied in DEI or CRT is at its heart a constant churning of those divisions in a way to separate us, and really does great damage to this idea, that America is an idea. I mean, there's no sort of common racial heritage. We're not like some, European country where they can, it's just different. Like, we believe in an idea, and if you accept that, you're an American. And so if they're successful in undermining that in institutions, and this sort of cultural pluralism that we love in this country, they'll get done what they never could have imagined they could get done, which I think is ultimately the goal, which is to have such unrest and instability in this country, that they can sort of remake it in this Marxist image. So from those experiences, I became Attorney General and saw it then again firsthand. When you saw what was happening in schools during the sort of the masking era of COVID, parents were also reaching out to us about that, but they were also starting to talk to us in our office about things that were happening in the classroom. Because remember, in COVID, people got more exposed to what was going on. And so what was critical race theory, and the left would always say, well, it's not a class. And I'm sure, Eric, you're going to talk about this. It doesn't need to be a class. If that's how you view your classroom in every setting, dividing people by oppressor and oppressed, it's a real problem. And so we uncovered through some sunshine requests or FOIA requests things like the oppression matrix. Students were grade school students forced to participate in things called privilege walks. And so to me, it only strengthened my resolve to sort of take that on in that job. And then now the job that I have now, you see this, whether it's in the military or writ large with this DEI offices. I just think we've got to uproot this, get rid of it, and celebrate the things that bring it, or understand that we're different. Right. I have a son with special needs. But they get away with in many ways of shaming people because of the way that it's labeled. I mean, equity, I don't really agree with that, but diversity and inclusion, of course, people want to be accepting of those things, but ultimately, that's not what this is about. It's about an ideology that separates people by race, principally, and it's really destructive. So I'm committed to the cause. I think it's really important for our country and what it means to be an American to find those things that bring us together, as opposed to constantly be focused on this division that's based exclusively on race, which ultimately plays out in a lot of discrimination.
Eric, you also have a unique perspective because you've taught in academia, you have held various roles. Can you talk about what brought you into this policy space?
Sure. A few years ago, as I'm just realizing, I went to a conference that was pretty much a flagship conference in my field, college composition and communication. During that conference, there was a keynote address that involved the argument that teaching standard English to black students was inherently racist. I pushed back on that a little bit by simply asking, is this a good idea? Standard English may come in handy one day, in one's civic or professional life. And the response to that really opened my eyes to how insidious this ideology is. And the destabilization thing that you mentioned before, I've seen that firsthand as well. The very same person who was giving that speech a couple of years later at the same conference lamented the fact that his African-American students did not want to write in black English because they were there to learn standard English, right? He was allowing them to write in black English or Ebonics or African-American vernacular English or whatever you want to call it. And when they refused to do that, he said they were, quote, selfish and immature. And he also said that if they do learn this standardized English, they'll just go out and be successful and maintain the status quo, right? Now, he said this out loud. It's on video. There's no shame to this at all. I mean, it's within this field that's quite normal. Within this prefigurative bubble that is rhetoric and composition, or the humanities in general, that is a relatively normal sentiment, right? So that destabilization thing is a primary goal, it seems. So that is why I'm here.
Well, Senator Schmitt, you had talked about some of the things that you had seen in higher ed and the impacts of DEI policy. Eric, I'm curious, what were some of the impacts that you witnessed when you were in higher ed?
Of DEI policy?
Specifically.
A lack of tolerance for dissenting ideas, right? Now, I am in the field of rhetoric and composition. We are experts in communication, right? So experts in communication who refuse to communicate, that should be concerning to a lot of people, not just inside academia, but outside academia. We are responsible for teaching objectivity or impartial research, right? We're the ones who are responsible for teaching critical thinking. When we fail to do that ourselves, when critical thinking is considered, quote unquote, a white way of knowing, that kind of contradicts our whole mission as educators. So that's generally what I'm seeing here. Just this idea that people who disagree should not be entertained, right? To entertain them, to converse with them, is to dignify them with a response, right? And therefore, it's antithetical to their purposes, right? If we talk, we can get along. If we talk, we can figure out ways to reform things and make them better. If we don't, then we can't, because reformation isn't the real goal. It's, well, at the risk of sounding dramatic, it's revolution.
Senator Schmitt, Eric recently testified on the issue of mandatory DEI programs at colleges and universities. What have you heard from constituents, or even in your own experience in higher education, of what's going on essentially in the state of Missouri?
Yeah, I think you have, sort of higher ed was the first spot, I think, and kind of the canary in the coal mine. And I'm 48, so I'm solidly Gen X. When I was an undergrad, a lot of these things were just sort of classes, like an elective. This is now a full-blown ideology that permeates higher ed institutions. And by the way, if you want to understand the anti-Semitism that's happening on college campuses, look no further than the DEI ideology. I gave a speech on the Senate floor after the October 7th massacre, and sort of this river to the sea chants. If you want to understand where that comes from, it is essentially dividing oppressor and oppressed, and they've picked who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed in that scenario. So it's a shortcut to think about anything. But for me, higher ed was that. It's made its way into K through 12 education. It's made its way now. The federal government has offices. We can talk about the military, because I'm on the Armed Services Committee. This has been a real focus of mine. So it's played out, and it's also in corporate America, obviously. And so for me, hearing from folks, there are just a lot of people who find the whole process insulting. It's demeaning, and in many ways, it's kind of the point. Right. It's kind of the point. And so you mentioned something about language. So you've got this sort of cultural Marxist aspect to it, but at the heart of it, too, is it's about power and control. It's about controlling what you can say, what you can think, what you can articulate. And I also, my previous job, filed the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit that was heard at the Supreme Court, the free speech lawsuit. Before Elon Musk had bought Twitter, before the Twitter files, before the congressional hearings, there was Missouri versus Biden, and in that discovery uncovered this vast censorship enterprise between government agencies, nonprofit. Why am I bringing that up? Because the left, right now, it is no longer about the free exchange of ideas. It's no longer about persuasion. It is about, to your point, the othering of other opinions that you don't agree with and shutting them down. And I just think that's a really, really dangerous road to go down as a free society. There's something cathartic about this pressure release valve of being able to speak your mind in the town square, virtual town square, or on a college campus. And when you limit that, again, it's a disastrous road.
Eric, Senator Schmitt touched on some of the factors and results of DEI policy. What do you think are philosophies and factors that create the problematic unintended consequences of DEI policy?
Well, we need a whole other event to really answer that, but I'm going to do my best to answer it quickly. There is an overarching ideology called critical social justice. CRT, critical race theory, is a subcategory of critical social justice. And what critical social justice is what was already mentioned, splitting society into oppressor and oppressed. The idea that the American way is systemically racist. In fact, the American way was put together for the express purpose of protecting whiteness, right? What's more, whiteness, and now we're getting into the subcategory of critical race theory and critical white studies, that's a thing. Whiteness, the definition has been broadened basically to mean classical liberal or even bourgeois attitudes that many proponents of critical social justice think are actually perpetuating racism. They help to hide the insidious racism in society. So critical social justice, critical race theory, it comes out of critical theory in general. Most popular from the Frankfurt School of sociology, things like that. There's a concept called repressive tolerance, which really means the repression of tolerance. And we just talked about it. You do not entertain the other side whatsoever. You do not agree at all with the other side whatsoever. If the other side agrees with you 99% of the time, but 1% they don't, they are altogether bad, right? You can see how that kind of ideology is manifesting these days on college campuses, and now even corporate America, and now even congregations, right? Churches, things like that. To add to that, a critical social justice theorist, the prominent theorist, the de facto leader of critical social justice, Derek Bell, wrote an essay called Racial Realism. And the conclusion, the ultimate conclusion in that essay is that, racism will never go away. We can't get rid of it. The best we can do is constantly push back, right? Constantly agitate, right? Constantly make white people uncomfortable. This is what he says, right? So you put those things together, Derek Bell's conclusion and the concept of repressive tolerance, and you get, well, what you see on college campuses these days. The intolerance of anything that smacks of classical liberal values, the pushing back on white comfort, right? There is a primary tenet to critical social justice. And that tenet is, the question isn't did something racist happen, it's how did it manifest in this situation, right? So racism is always already around. And it is it's manifested in every interracial interaction. Somehow this is racist, right? I wish I could say I was kidding, I'm not. Somehow this is racist. What's more, another primary tenet is that anything that makes white people comfortable is suspect. Yeah, that can't go wrong, huh? Right? So put all those things together and you have critical social justice, you have what's going on college campuses, and you have what is undergirding diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not things like equality, individuality, right? Diversity is a good thing, inclusion is a good thing. I love this image up here because it's not just fingerprints of a bunch of colors, fingerprints are individual, right? They're one of a kind. So we have individuals of different colors there, not group members to be pitted against other groups, right? Another primary tenet of critical social justice. So I will stop there.
Well, and
No, please.
I actually think this is you hit on something too that's really important. And again, just taking sort of an American point of view here, the founding was bold. It said to the world a bunch of things, but it also said that as individual souls, we're endowed with certain rights. That aspect of individual rights is under assault too by an assertion of sort of this collectivist mentality, and again, very dangerous. And I'll just hearken to so Tocqueville comes to America in the 1830s, and he writes essentially this travel dispatch back to Europe about what's going on in America. It's just this economic dynamism, the War of 1812 is over and all this, and what's going on. And so he travels to, at the time, I think it was 19 states or something. He's writing back. And what he discovers, he thinks he's going to find some great bureaucratic ingenuity in Washington. But that is not what he discovered. Same is true now. But what he found was that what made America unique was we're a nation of joiners. That this real sense of cultural pluralism, these different layers that define us. I am, of German descent, Italian descent, Irish descent. I like beer, I like the barbecue, I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan, I'm Catholic, all these different things that define who I am as an individual. What DEI ultimately does is sort of wipes all of that away, and you are whatever. You're white or you're black, and that's the only thing that matters. And that is, I think, if we get an opportunity to talk to people about what this really is and educate, we can have disagreements. That's okay. But when you sort of destroy or wipe away any sense of individuality or perspective or background or experience, it's a very dangerous thing, and it also makes it easier to sort of this othering that I mentioned before. You know, when you got Dark Brandon, Joe Biden, labeling half of the country as the enemy. It's easier to do that when you are in this, when you have this kind of this worldview.
So we've talked a lot about higher education and philosophy, so I want to talk a little bit about the DEI policy and government. Specifically, Senator Schmitt, you introduced an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act known as NDAA. This would have put a hiring freeze on DEI initiatives in the military and would have made the Government Accountability Office conduct an audit of federal DEI programs. What are some additional policy proposals that could help the federal government gauge the overall impact of these policies? Yeah,
so that was a big win. The NDAA, for people who don't know, and by the way, not that I'm some expert, I've been in Washington for 15 months, but on the Armed Services Committee, we don't have a lot of what's regular order, meaning there's like committee and then it passes one chamber and there's a conference committee. We end up right now with these, it's broken, these sort of omnibus monstrosities, and members don't have a ton of input, it's leadership, and that causes a lot of division. But on the Armed Services Committee, we actually do go through that process. The full committee meets, and through the course of a few days, amendments are offered. And this was a bipartisan amendment, barely bipartisan, but bipartisan, to essentially have this hiring freeze and have this study done, which is ongoing. So that was a win. That made it all the way through. So I do think there's progress being made. I also have another bill that would wipe out these DEI offices. They're just gone. I think it's an incredible waste of resources for all the reasons that we've talked about here today. So I think there's movement on this. I do think that the American people are aware of this. You see the left now, the proponents of DEI really getting defensive about this, because for a while they were able to get away with sort of these platitudes about inclusivity, and when people really dig in and see what it's about, they understand that this just isn't anything they want to be a part of. So I think part of this process from a policymaker, but also in our communities where this stuff really matters, I just don't think, looking to Washington to solve these issues, a lot of this is just going to be kind of, within communities and real people and social interaction in the churches, and how we deal with one another, is to really push back and speak up. Because as both Eric mentioned, Erec Smith and Eric Schmitt.
Yeah.
We planned that.
Right. Part of the point is to silence people so that they are uncomfortable to speak the truth. And I don't, I'm sure my grade school teachers wouldn't be surprised. I'm not afraid of that. I think that this is an important cause, so.
Eric, you've actually written on the senator's NDAA amendment. Can you expand on why you think it's important, and are there other policy proposals that maybe we haven't talked about that the government should consider?
Well, first of all, sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So if we can have an audit and look into these things and see exactly what's going on, then people can be aware of the fact that this is not diversity, equity, and inclusion in the way they think it is, right? There are common definitions of those terms, and then there are critical social justice definitions of those terms. And the latter one is the one undergirding all of this. Secondly, the resources. They can be used in much more beneficial ways. Whether you're talking about higher education or corporate America, we can have outreach programs to targeted demographics. We can have mentoring programs, right? These things cost money. The money's there. It's just being spent on, bad ideas, as we are trying to establish today, right? So spending money on those kind of things will help diversify America, corporate America, higher education. what have you. And it will also protect the concept of merit, right? Under critical social justice ideology, merit is also a inherently racist thing, right? Because it hides some kind of racial bias or something like that. Now, does everybody live up to meritocracy? No. I'm sure there are people out there who are still hiring their nephews and stuff like that, right? But the onus is on us to do better about that, not to get rid of or demonize the concept of meritocracy. So if we have these outreach programs, we have mentorship and things like that, we can ensure that the merit is acquired, right? And we can do that directly ourselves, right? So that when people do enter the job market or apply for colleges, they have the requisite skills to succeed.
Senator Schmitt, you had mentioned the bill that you had introduced regarding eliminating DEI programs. You've also recently tweeted, "We need to eliminate DEI positions across the federal government." Are there goals advocated by the proponents of having DEI offices in this space that you support? And if so, is there a better policy to pursue those goals rather than what's in place now?
Yeah, I think that Eric sort of touched on it. I think it's providing more opportunities, right? It's sort of an equality of opportunity in the whole aspect of equity. There's no such thing as guaranteeing a result. It just doesn't. So that of those terms, it's to most people. Although they're trying to replace equality with equity at every turn, and those terms have two very, very different meanings. I think that I'll just use this as an example. So in the military, I've been in the questioning of including people like Lloyd Austin or others who are policymakers at the Pentagon. This has become also the policy, right, of DOD, DEI, a lot of acronyms, and try to make the point again. If you think about this for a minute, there's a reason why they wear a uniform. There's a reason why you can't grow your hair out. You're building commonality because you have a very important job. Other people depend on you, and a country depends on you. And there's no greater example of a true meritocracy in this country than our military, our armed services. People from the lowest economic rung of the ladder or any race can have ticker tape parades thrown for them in New York City, right? That we celebrate our military heroes. And to go in because of, again, this sort of social experiment, this cultural Marxism, and be dividing recruits in that way, I just think takes us backwards. It really does. It takes us backwards. And so again, I think that, what are the things that we can do? We ought to be talking about the benefits of this and paying for college at historically black colleges and universities. There's ways to bring more people in, to give people opportunity. But the programming that's involved with all of this, again, is what most people don't see, and I think why it's incumbent to continue to highlight this issue.
You mentioned bringing people in. Is that something you see that has to happen at the federal level, or how can it happen at all levels of government?
Yeah, well, I think that my view is, as a small government kind of guy, I just think the change that we're seeking, or what I'm advocating for, right? There's a role for a U.S. senator to play, or a local mayor to play, or whatever. But I just think that ultimately the way that we beat this the very divisive and discriminatory ideology back is in communities with real people who've seen the repercussions of it, who can better understand how divisive this is. And I do think people are getting it now. I really do. I think, a few years into this being highlighted, people understand it, especially if they've seen it in their kids' education. If they've seen that. And I think that that's being exposed to it and doing something about it locally and among real people, as opposed to some, the foreign policy establishment here in Washington is a much better route.
Eric, similar question to you. How do you see, looking ahead down the road, how should the policy approach be on these types of issues?
I agree with the senator that things should happen at the local level. And we should utilize our freedom of association to do just that. There are a lot of nonprofits out there who are trying to do the right thing when it comes to diversifying in a way that is undergirded by a classical liberal framework. I'm the president and co-founder of one called Free Black Thought, and we're trying to do just that. But we got together, we found like-minded people, we got together and we created this nonprofit to do just that. We should let people know how exactly to do that, right? A lot of people think it's too complicated. Not really. Where there's a will, there's definitely a way. And there's also power in numbers. I also like the concept of superordination. What I mean by that is when a bunch of disparate groups, apparently, have a similar goal that they can only accomplish together. So they have to work together to do this. Now, various studies have shown that constant interaction like that, especially one that is based on superordinate goals, can enhance racial tolerance. It helps people get along, right? Because you're actually seeing this person as a human being working with you towards the same goal. So all that wraps into this idea of constant contact at the local level, and we can do this ourselves. I like the idea that nobody's coming to save us, right? Nobody's coming to save us, we can save ourselves. It's been done, it can be done, it needs to be done for this.
Senator Schmitt, I'll give you the last word before we go to questions. As we look down the road, as we look ahead to how we're going to kind of look at this from a policy perspective, is there something we haven't talked about today that you see as critical to achieving these goals of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is about?
I just think it's really important to have the courage to speak up about it. It can be intimidating for people who just want to get on with their day. They don't want to be called a name, or they don't really want to be singled out in any particular way. I think that's understandable, but I do think it's going to take good people standing up. In corporate America, the agenda of some of these HR folks it's pretty radical, actually. That's a whole nother topic. But for people to say, this isn't, but you risk losing your job. Think about the leverage on all this, right? It's on a university where your grades are at stake, or your job is at stake. And so for me, I try to keep in mind in my job. I certainly did as Attorney General when I was the lawyer for the people. I certainly view my role now as I understand that can be challenging for people in their individual situations. So it certainly emboldens me to want to fight for them, because I understand how difficult that can be. But I do think that that's where it has to happen. I think, and why free speech is so important, and the courage to speak up and call this out. I think that's just the key here.
Okay. Well, now we're going to move into some audience questions. For those of you who are online, feel free to continue to submit your questions. We've got some microphones that are going to be floated around, and we will start taking questions. Are we good? Okay, we will. Let's start here, actually, right in the back here.
Where is? Okay.
Right here. Yeah, you. Oh, he's going to bring a microphone, yeah. And please state your name and then your question, yeah.
Okay, my name's Hiroshi, and thank you so much for your discussion. So I came to the States from Japan 2 years ago, and what surprised me the most about the States is exactly this silencing of different views. So my question is how private universities should deal with these whole issues, and as policymakers, if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear that.
Well, like I said before, there are ways of doing outreach, right, and mentoring programs. I think those things are imperative. They've been shown to work, right? And they do already exist in some sense. We have bridge programs in which minorities, before their freshman year, they get together that summer, they take classes, they immerse themselves on campus, and things like that. I think the summer before freshman year is too late. I think those outreach programs need to go into middle schools, high schools. I think we should immerse middle school and high school children, or kids, I guess, young adults, less old people, I don't know.
The youngs.
The youngins. We should immerse them in the experience. What is it like to be a biology major at this institution? What's it like to be an English major at this university? Don't just go to them, but bring them to the campus. Familiarize them with it so that the culture shock that apparently happens when people go from their homogenous neighborhood to a more heterogeneous campus is not so daunting, right? I think that's a good idea. I think that's the best use of our resources right now, and I would like to see more of that.
Yeah, and to touch on the larger point about suppression of ideas and dissent, I'm a little biased in the sense that when I was, years ago, would give a commencement address, I haven't been asked recently, but I would talk about free speech. It's a passion of mine, and then this, of course, the Missouri versus Biden case, we plowed ahead, and that is what it is now. I think that, again, in the K through 12 setting, you're talking about reaching younger people. There's a real cost for essentially replacing a lot of what we're talking about today, replacing sort of civics with a lot of what's being pushed now in K through 12 education. Because I do think if you have a level of understanding about American government or the nature of the founding, or why is it that we diffuse power? Why is it that we have separation of powers and federalism? Well, it was to protect individual liberty. These are sort of these concepts that really are that undergird the conversation we're having now. Because if all you ever do is just sort of skip to this and a coined phrase that might poll well, it allows a lot of mischief for people who, again, want to disrupt and want to create chaos. And one of the things I think that's worth pointing, you mentioned merit, the sort of Marxist ideology, it never really worked economically. It sort of never really took hold in this country, because we do believe in merit. We do believe that people can succeed, because there's examples everywhere, right? There's examples of people who came from nothing and who are billionaires, or whatever your measure of success is. It's not just money. Whatever your measure of success is, this has been a country people have come to achieve that, and they've been able to do it. So that narrative never really worked. So what do you do then? You attack merit. If you can get people to believe that their own individual talents or ambition or intelligence or anything doesn't matter, that the deck is completely stacked. First of all, it's a crime to that individual, robs them of really important things that they could do in their life and confidence that they might have. But also it gets to this, that maybe you can actually change the whole of society. Maybe you can actually get people to believe that America is not exceptional. And I think one of the worst things that Barack Obama ever said when he was asked this question about American exceptionalism is he responded by saying, yeah, I believe in American exceptionalism, just like, the Irish Prime Minister might believe in Irish exceptionalism, and went through a litany of other countries. That entirely misses the point. America is the exception in history for the things that we're talking about, this belief that we have individual rights, that each one of us is endowed by Creator with those, and government's job is to protect those rights. That's it. Like, the government is there to protect your individual rights. Now, you wouldn't believe that in this town with all the stuff that we do, but that's actually the idea. And again, I talked about the structure of government to protect individual liberty. So the point is, having a better understanding of what that's all about can only help us in these big debates about things like DEI. And that's been cut out to make way for other stuff.
Let's go to an online question. Lawrence, can you give us a question?
Yes. So one of our online participants says, DEI is a flagship at my current corporate job, seemingly coming from top leadership. Does the government play a role in the emerging prevalence of DEI programs in corporate America? If not, what is the genesis of these programs?
Well, I'll just go first about one way I think that we're going to have to get after this in corporate America, and maybe I'm a little biased because of my prior job. I think that litigation ultimately will be a big deterrent here because inherently many of these, the programming, the policies, and the ideology behind it is discriminatory. And so the laws that were rightfully enacted to protect people from being discriminated against because of their race, I think are going to play a very important role in, getting DEI out of corporate America. I certainly would advocate for that. But again, you're talking to a former AG that sued, 67 school districts for their COVID policies in the Biden administration. We won on the student loan debt. We had the Missouri versus. So I have seen that as an avenue that works. And so I think that's what's coming. But again, I think the root of this all is, and let me just talk a little bit briefly about, it also is it's a cop-out for HR departments and executives oftentimes to sort of check a box to say that's what we did. We've addressed something by doing this training, and really gets people off the hook of doing the harder work of actually, being involved in communities and volunteerism and getting to know people and understanding the things that I think are really important. So for organizations.
I think there should be a better vetting process for the underlying ideology of these DEI initiatives. Coca-Cola famously, gaffed on this when a whistleblower showed some of the slides that were being shown during a DEI meeting, workshop, things like that. They were not conducive to camaraderie, right? The kind of thing you like to see in a corporate office. One of the, I think the last slide said, try to be less white. That's not going to work. I don't think that's going to work, But a lot of these initiatives come from a set of people, Robert DiAngelo, Tima Oken, and what those people in particular, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, what these entities do is they demonize the very things that are conducive to corporate success, like objectivity, individualism, right? These things are considered aspects of whiteness, right? And therefore inherently oppressive to anybody who isn't white. This is absurd. It's a lack of critical thinking, right? The critical and critical social justice does not mean what you think it means. It just means counter-hegemonic. It means pushing back, right? So if they can vet things and make sure that these DEI initiatives, if they have them, are undergirded by classical liberal values that, kind of hold up this country, right? Then that can go a long way towards getting rid of this divisiveness.
Yeah, and just real quickly too on that, this has become a cottage industry. The DEI consultant, play, and a lot of public institutions are paying millions and millions of dollars for this as well. I mean, one of the things that people could do is run for school board. That would be a way to affect change because, we uncovered again in my prior job, school districts across Missouri that were spending millions and millions and millions and millions of taxpayer dollars on this kind of stuff. And if they were honest, and sunlight being the greatest disinfectant, if they were honest with taxpayers, they would reject this stuff. So.
Yeah, and we should, realize that if you're making good money fighting racism, the last thing you want is for racism to go away, right? You want to make more of it, right? You want a bigger house now. Okay, so now, everything's racist. Great, pay me, right? So that has to be something we need to think about.
Let's take another audience question right over here. So, yep, there you go, Lawrence.
Thank you. My name is Greg Squires. I've taught at 5 different universities over about 40-year period of time, 15 years of which I was chair of my department.
I'm sorry.
And I'm not bragging, I'm suffering, believe me.
You made it to the other side.
I did. And I want to say first, Eric, everything you said about writing, I couldn't agree with more. I think if you want to advocate libertarian, conservative, liberal, Marxist perspective, you can't do it if you can't speak the language and write good English so that you can be persuasive. I agree with that completely. But I have to push back on almost everything else that was said here today. There's no DEI advocate who thinks race is everything. There's lots of critics of DEI who think race is nothing today. When I think of othering, I think of no better example than what Donald Trump and his supporters say about immigrants and the vermin that they represent. If you want to talk about repressive tolerance, who's advocating book burning? Book banning.
Can we have a question?
And so I guess what I want to say is, having been through lots of these discussions where there's lots of inaccurate straw men that are presented, how do we get to a point where the different people who are part of this debate can have these discussions like this one that are based on evidence and not anecdote?
Yeah, listen, I appreciate you being here and even having a different point of view. I mean, my own personal experience, when I was in college, I would go watch speakers that I knew I was probably going to disagree with, but maybe there was something I took from that, or I understood an argument better, as a way to go after it. And but I think the broader point I'm trying to make, at least, is I fear we're losing that because there isn't a tolerance for diversity of thought. And I'm okay with people disagreeing with me, I mean, and I think there has to be a willingness to not only try to persuade, but being open to being persuaded on things. And that's the march that I see. I mean, I can just tell you in the discovery in that lawsuit, I mean, we had some idea. You had Jen Psaki at the podium saying we're flagging this stuff for Facebook. We had some idea that the government was involved in working with these social media giants to suppress speech, but the extent of it, the vast nature of it, was really shocking. And I still remember a time, like I said, I don't feel like I'm not young. I don't think I'm 48, but I still remember when liberals were fierce defenders of free speech, and that's what I guess I think the clarion call is that we've got to be willing to hear divergent point of views and not try to demonize that or shut it down, which is even worse, right? It's even worse. So that's sort of how I approach it, and maybe that's a way forward. Again, that's why I taught that class, because I felt like if we all at least had a relatively shared understanding of what this country's supposed to be about, and we can disagree about how we get to a better place or who's in office or whatever, that goes a long way. But if fundamentally we don't even believe, we think that America's inherently, a bad place, and I think that puts a lot of things at risk that are important. That are important. So
these aren't straw men at all. I've written books, heavily researched. I've written articles on this. There are videos of this stuff online. I have emails that can tell you about this. There aren't book burnings, but there are books you don't read and books you don't critique. This is happening. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've interviewed other people who have seen it with their own eyes. And it doesn't even matter, if you're a black person talking about this. If you're black and talking about it, then you are multiracially white. Right? I've been called a white supremacist by white people. Right? That is real. Right? So to tell me that we're, basing all this on a straw man is to, wait for this, is to deny my lived experience. Right? So there you have it. I can give you a bibliography later on if you want.
Let's go to an online question. Lawrence, do we have another one?
So this one isn't a question, but I'd like to add it in there. Alice just thinks that the two Erics are doing super.
Two Erics are what?
Super.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Good name.
Thanks. Well, unless you're, how old are you?
I don't want to talk about
Okay, unless you were born in the 70s, there's very few people named Eric walking around. So to have two Erics on the stage is a little unique.
So another one of our online participants asked, how do you respond to a passionate young person who's very sincere in wanting to improve the world but may disagree with you? What are your thoughts on that?
Can you repeat it, please? I'm sorry.
How do you respond to a passionate young person who is supportive of DEI and sincere in wanting to improve the world but may disagree with you? How do you respond?
I hope that person can have a conversation with me, right? And I hear him out. I listen actively, and what I mean by that is I make sure that I'm getting his or her point correct before I start talking, right? Constantly ask, okay, so I hear you saying this, I hear you saying that. And until you get it right, you keep asking those questions. Good faith, sincere, constructive dialogue with that person. I think there are good ways to do diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think there are very bad ways. We're talking about the bad ways today, right? So I'd be happy to talk to somebody with that, about that. The problem is, talking across differences is not as cool as it used to be.
Yeah, and I, again, for me, I played a lot of, which was helpful. Anyway, I grew up in a really blue-collar area, actually, and desegregation in St. Louis County was happening. So I was going to school with a pretty racially diverse group of people. I played a lot of sports, so that was my experience. And so I grew up, thankfully, with the experience that I didn't care. Like I just wanted to win, and whoever was on my team, that was my teammate. And so I think these things that people do in their lives where they can have different experiences with other people of different backgrounds is really important. But I also think, again, for the young person who gets just sort of thrown this ideology in their face all the time about what it means, whiteness. So my dad's side of the family, I'm sharing a lot of my personal background. My dad's side, it's all German, like German Americans, whatever. My grandmother was the first, she was Italian, to marry an Irishman in the history of her family, which was a culture. It was a sort of a culture clash. So I just trying to think, going back to when they met, to try to say that whiteness is some monolith. It's ridiculous. So the point of that is to say that, again, we are individuals with different layers that define us. And I just think, again, it's a very dangerous thing to just sort of say, this half of the room, because of your skin color, you're the oppressor and you're the oppressed. It is by design divisive, and the result means that people would be discriminated against because of their race ultimately, and I oppose that on all levels. So I just think getting to know people individually, understanding that we have a bunch of different things that define who we are as individuals. I think if you walk into a conversation or a debate with that understanding, I think it goes a long way, as opposed to just, you're here and I'm here.
Let's take another audience question. How about this gentleman right here? That's fine. Either one. That's fine.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Todd Wiggins. First of all, I want to say it's a pleasure to see both of you on stage together. I think you guys should do a road show. You really have something interesting to say. I'm a little older than you, in the sense that I do remember the 70s, and I remember the ideas that were fostered during the 70s that still haven't come to fruition. So I want to ask you, going forward, especially in November, are we going to be better off, or is this election going to just expose more fissures that we still haven't fixed? And if not, who should be running? Should it be you, or should it be someone else, or are we missing out on somebody else that should be part of this debacle?
I'm going to let you take that one.
Well, look, politics is always messy. It's kind of supposed to be. I mean, anybody that thinks that we live in a difficult time as far as choosing who the next leader will be. I mean, look at the election of 1800. I mean, look at the 1860s. I mean, but the founders, the genius of America was that we could wrestle with these really difficult problems and come to a political result. And part of that, and by the way, not the way that most of the world still resolves these kind of disputes, which is through, violence or things like that. So, and again, I get back to the idea of why the First Amendment is so important. If people feel shut out, I think the founders had a great understanding of human nature. There's always going to be factions. And one of the reasons why they, again, created this widely dispersed system of government was that people could, and also that no one, not just one branch, but no one person ever had too much power. Our system of checks and balances ensures that. So, I think for me, the answer is I'm supporting the Republican nominee, and I think there's a lot of important things that can get done. But I also understand that other people are going to have a different point of view, and we resolve those disputes, through the election. And I think this is going to be a historic one. You just don't often have. It's only happened one other time in American history where you have, somebody who was president running against, the same person in sort of that rematch. And so, again, I'm always skeptical of people say things are unprecedented. Because there's really not a whole lot new under the sun. But I think, and if you have that historical, by the way, so speaking of free speech, if you have that historical context, I do think, especially for younger people, to have a historical context of, we've grappled with a lot of difficult issues. I do think it gives you some comfort that we're going to be okay. But personally, I think there's a lot on the line in the election. And again, I won't get into a speech about that. That's not appropriate for this forum, but I appreciate the question.
Let's go to one more online question. Lawrence, can we do another one?
So this is another question about corporate America. One of our online participants asked, how pervasive is DEI in corporate America, and how is it enforced? Is DEI just good business, responding to what customers want, value-driven purchasing?
I'll let you do this one.
Yeah, okay. So how is it manifesting in corporate America, basically? Well, I did mention a little while ago some of the main drivers of the problematic version of DEI we've been talking about today. The Robin DiAngelos and Tima Okins of the world. There are organizations, there are government structures that have adopted their views, and what they do is they demonize these concepts that, well, are part and parcel of the American way, quote unquote, right? I talked about equality, individuality, objectivity, or at least the attempt to be impartial with certain things. And it's manifesting in that way. What's more, there's just one workshop in which you hear all this stuff, and then you move on, right? And they'll do it again, maybe next year or next quarter or something like that. And it doesn't really take. People are just sitting there, being abused, or their intelligence is being assaulted, or something like that, and then they move on. Nothing's really happening. In fact, some studies show that it gets worse after the workshops because now people are resentful, oh, okay, so now I have to feel bad for being white? Yeah, well, take that, whatever, something like that. So that is happening. That's a very real thing. And that's how it's manifesting in corporate America, and which is why I think we should put those resources into those outreach programs, those mentoring programs. Let HR deal with grievances and things like that, and put the rest of that money into that. Leave the office, go out to the people you want to hire to help diversify your company, talk to them at a young age, and I think a lot of this will take care of itself.
Well, we unfortunately have come to the end of this discussion. Thank you both so much for being here and talking about this. If you've enjoyed forums like this, please be sure to check out cato.org for our upcoming events. And for those of you who are here, you are welcome to join us for a luncheon on the second floor afterwards. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Hey, good job. Good to see you.
Likewise.
Yeah, thank you. All right.